Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. I just want to put together a review of Chapter 5 and 6. This will be what Test 3 will be on. I haven't quite decided how I'm going to put Test 3 out yet. I may just send you guys the PDF, circle the correct answers, answer the essay questions, and send that back to me, or may be able to put it on SchoolNet, but I'll let you guys know exactly what I'm going to do about Test 3 in the next couple days. But I wanted to give you guys a review lecture like I would before we would take the test in class. So this is just going to be talking about the major things that you need to know for test 3. And so we are jumping back pretty far. We're going back to the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation held the United States together. It was drafted before the Revolutionary War, held the United States together during the war. But after the war, there's many problems with the Articles of Confederation, mainly economic, leadership, and military. Economic, there was no standard currency in the United States. Each state was printing its own different currency. In class, we talked about all the problems that would create. Also, we had no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation. So we had the legislative branch that could make laws, but we had nobody to enforce those laws. So a lot of the laws passed by the early Congress under the Articles of Confederation really went unenforced. They pretty much just passed these laws. People necessarily didn't have to abide by them because, again, there's no executive branch to enforce those laws. And there was also no judicial branch, so there was nobody to interpret the Constitution. There was really not many checks on power that we'll see that the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution later on. And then the military was also a mess. Every state had its own militia. They were very unorganized. I mean, this worked during the American Revolution, but if the United States is going to be able to defend itself from major powers like Britain and France, we're going to need some organization in the military. So the Founding Fathers go back to the drawing board. Again, we talked about them meeting in secret. And there's multiple plans that are proposed. We have the Virginia Plan, sometimes called the Big State Plan. This one wanted a national legislature that would be bicameral, meaning it would have two houses or groups of representatives. And this Virginia plan was going to be based on population, Virginia being the most populated state at the time. You could see why they would want the Virginia plan to pass because they would get more power in Congress. Then we had the New Jersey plan, which was put together to kind of protect the small states. New Jersey, as you guys know, is a pretty tiny state, and it wanted to keep a lot of the ideas of the Articles of Confederation. Wanted to establish a unicameral system, which meant there would be one legislative body, and each state would be represented equally. And so we have what's called the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise. For our purposes, just remember it as the Great Compromise, in which the Founding Fathers really take these two plans, Virginia and New Jersey, stick them together, and that's what we have in the Constitution today. We have the Senate, which represents each state equally, and then we have the House of Representatives, which is based on population. There's other compromises made, such as the Three-Fifths Compromise. Southern states wanted slaves to be counted in population totals, getting them more representation. So they strike a balance where they say, we'll count 3 out of every 5 slaves in population totals. And so this was really put into the Constitution to get the southern states to ratify the Constitution in its final form. Also, we have checks and balances. So that just pretty much means that we have 3 branches of government. Each has its own power. No one branch of government can become too powerful. And this is supposed to protect our government from becoming tyrannical, from taking over and abusing power. Keep one branch from abusing its power. And so they put together this Constitution, but it's time to get it ratified. And remember, the Articles of Confederation, as I had talked about in class, was too hard to amend. You had to have all 13 states agree. With ratifying the Constitution, you only needed 9 out of 13 states to get it passed. And so we see 2 factions start to form in the Constitutional Convention. We have the Federalists, who supported the Constitution in its early format without a Bill of Rights. Then we had the Anti-Federalists, mainly led by Thomas Jefferson, who opposed this Constitution because he said that it did not protect individual liberties, did not protect those individual rights. And so, in order to get all the states to ratify the Constitution, they had to add the Bill of Rights, which, as you guys know, is the first 10 amendments, which protects many of your individual rights as an American citizen. So, with the Bill of Rights, we get the ratification of the Constitution. It becomes the supreme law of the land, still is the supreme law of the land today. Nobody's above it. Even presidents, senators, everybody has to abide by the Constitution. Also, the government cannot infringe upon any of your rights that are in those first 10 amendments. So make sure you know what they are. We have the delegated powers, which are powers expressly stated or implied. We also have the reserved powers, which are powers not specifically stated within the Constitution and reserved for the state. So the reserved powers are things like education, your driver's license, those sort of things the state has control over. It says nothing about the federal government controlling those things. Therefore, the power to regulate those things are left to the states. And then the Constitution structure itself, we have Articles 1, 2, and 3, which are mainly the most important because they lay out the three branches of government. So, Article 1 is the legislative branch, number 2 is the executive branch, and number 3 is the judiciary branch. And there's other articles that lay out, how elections are to be done, in further detail on how we should structure our government. But we have the Bill of Rights, as I said, first 10 amendments that are added to the Constitution during the ratification process to get more states on board. And so the first president of the United States, all of you probably know, is George Washington. He establishes what is called a presidential cabinet. We still have this today. It's a lot larger today than it was in Washington's time. But pretty much with the executive branch, the president is the commander-in-chief. He's the boss of the executive branch. And he gets to appoint people in his cabinet. So it'd be like he gets to appoint, his assistant managers on how or people that he's going to name heads of executive departments, such as Secretary of State, Secretary of War. All these people, the president gets to name who holds those positions. And Washington is the first president to do so and set up exactly how that process goes. We have the issues of settling debt. We talked all about Hamilton's economic plan. With Hamilton's economic plan, he wanted to establish the National Bank, wanted to pay off those debts so that way the country, could have that good credit score. So that way we wouldn't, or we'd be able to borrow money in the future. We have strict and loose construction. Simply those mean strict construction. You can only do exactly what the Constitution says. These will be people like Thomas Jefferson. Then we have loose construction, which means that the federal government can do whatever is necessary and proper for the good of the nation, and these will be more people like Alexander Hamilton. Again, we have a debate over the National Bank, but ultimately the National Bank gets passed. It regulates money, so the United States will have one currency. It settles the debt, assumes all the debts from the states. Remember, the southern states weren't too happy about this. They'd already paid off their debts. The northern states were extremely happy because now, they didn't have to worry about them as the federal government's problem. But he is successful in raising the money to pay off these debts. And one of the ways he is able to raise money is with a tax on whiskey. And you have what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. Western farmers rise up. They storm and shut down the debtor courts, people that were trying to take their farms for not paying their taxes. And Washington, being the head of the executive branch, he's the enforcer of these laws. He's going to enforce this tax. So he gets the militia together, goes in there, and stops this rebellion. And this really establishes the power of the executive branch to enforce those laws, to keep the United States out of rebellion or domestic rebellion. So we talked about Washington's farewell address. One of the main things that Washington does is his neutrality proclamation. In 1793, Washington pronounces the United States will remain neutral in the French Revolution. Remember, the French had helped us in the American Revolution. They were our first ally. You had people like Thomas Jefferson said, yeah, we need to help the French. They helped us in our revolution. But Washington knows that getting entangled in a European war, the United States just wasn't ready to take that on. We didn't have a powerful military. We were still trying to pay off debts. It would mainly have been detrimental to the United States at that time. It could have, wiped us out as a nation. One of those countries could have tried to take back control of the United States between England and France. So Washington does the smart thing. He stays out of the fight. We have some issues still going on with the British and the French. You have Jay's Treaty, which the British agreed to pay for damages to American ships and give up forts in the Northwest. This really doesn't happen. We have Pinckney's Treaty, which is to try to settle border disputes with Spain. It's a little bit more successful. And then we have John Adams' presidency. And during his presidency, you have the XYZ affair. That was during the French Revolution when French diplomats had asked the United States for bribes. The United States refused, and this really sways public opinion away from helping the French during their revolution. They're like, how could you expect us to help you? You're supposed to be our ally. Why are you asking us for bribes? So it turns the American public away from helping the French during the revolution. We also have the Alien and Sedition Acts, wildly unpopular, but they were passed under Adams' presidency because you had certain French revolutionaries coming to the United States trying to start revolution here in the United States, and to keep our government intact, to make sure it didn't crumble in these early stages, they passed the Alien Sedition Acts, which limited what you could say against the government. Also was the first limits on immigration to the United States. And so we have Jefferson's presidency, and I did a whole lecture on this if you want to go back and look at that to get more detail. But the main points of his presidency that you need to know about is the election of 1800. The reason the election of 1800 is important is the first time that power is transferred from the Federalist to the Anti-Federalist, at this time now called Democratic Republicans. So we have a peaceful transition of power. You have the Louisiana Purchase, which you can see down there in the corner, and I'll show you on the next slide. Over doubles the size of the United States. You have the exploration of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, who go to explore this land. They're commissioned by Thomas Jefferson to go out and explore and see what is out there. Nobody knew exactly what lay out west. So Lewis and Clark had both worked for the military. Sacagawea was their young Native American guide. She was only about 16 at the time that she left with them, and also carried a baby with her along most of that journey and helped them translate everything as they went out west. So a vital part of that expedition. Then we have the Judiciary Act. This names new positions in the Supreme Court that can be appointed by the president. And then the most important court case is Marbury versus Madison during Jackson's presidency, because it established judicial review. And this is really what gives the Supreme Court the power to interpret the Constitution. So judicial review gives the Supreme Court its power, and that was established in Marbury versus Madison. And so this last, or actually I got one more about the War of 1812, but again I just want to show you exactly how big the Louisiana Purchase was. One of the best real estate deals in history. The United States paid somewhere around 3 cents an acre for this land. And the Louisiana Purchase is important because it will be brought up throughout the rest of our class about, what should happen with this Western territory. Should we allow slavery in this Western territory? Should we outlaw slavery in this Western territory? So as settlers start going out west and new states start popping up in the West, there'll be a big debate over should these states become slave states or free states. And this will be some of the steps that we'll look at leading up to the Civil War. And on that note of war, the War of 1812, I did a lecture on this as well, so go back and look at that. But the main things that you need to know is the cause and effects. So we have the British impressment of U.S. soldiers. They were taking soldiers off American ships and forcing them into the British Navy. We have the interference in American shipping, so sinking American ships that may be trying to sell goods to the French, and British military aids to the natives. And so the British were supplying Native Americans in the Northwest Territory with weapons to fight against the American settlers. So Americans look at this as pretty much a betrayal, and war eventually is declared. James Monroe is president at this time. Thomas Jefferson has already served his 2 terms. But the main thing and the main effects of this war is a surge in national pride. The United States has, for the second time, defeated the most powerful country in the world at this time. American manufacturing is boosted. Americans start to industrialize. And Native American resistance is weakened. So the Native Americans are really pushed out in the Northwest Territory, and American settlers or those lands are opened up to American settlers. And if you look at the battles here, on the bottom right corner, you can see there's a lot of blue stars, which show that there was a lot of American victories in this war. The British had very limited success in the War of 1812, even with them trying to blockade the East Coast. Still didn't work. The U.S. was able to supply itself. It was a lot better, or a lot more prepared for war than it was in the Revolutionary War. And one of the key battles is at the end of the war with New Orleans. In the Battle of New Orleans, a young general at the time named Andrew Jackson will have a major victory there. Even though the war was already over, news traveled slow, he still kicked the British out of New Orleans, and this will gain him some recognition as a war hero, and he will, be, I believe he is the 10th or 8th president of the United States. So we'll be talking about Jackson in the coming week. Pretty interesting stuff, and so I hope you guys find this helpful. Make sure you know this major information for your test.